today we're going to take a look at a series of DVDs on one of my favorite openings from even my childhood, the 2 C3 Sicilian. And why is this important? Well, to start with, quite a few players, including Gary Kasparov and Bobby Fischer, consider 1 E4 to be absolutely White's best move. And it's also pretty universally accepted that against E4, Black's most fighting response is C5, the Sicilian defense. And frankly, who has time to learn every single specialized variation of the Sicilian defense? So, what you need is you need an opening like I had with the C3 Sicilian that you can basically play 2 C3 and Black is playing on your home turf. So in this first series of DVDs, we will look at playing 2 C3 and then we will look at primarily 2 D5, which is Black's most popular response. We will also look at all of the, quote, weaker second move alternatives, G6, 2 D6, 2 B6, even 2 Queen A5 was first played by Sigbert Tarrasch. We'll take a look at that, even 2 E5. We'll look at all the minor alternatives that Black has, and we'll show you how to play against them. The other things we will do is, rather than just show you specific variations, we'll start with a historical overview. In the historical overview, we will see fantastic strategists such as Aaron Nimzovich. We will see the 3rd and 4th world champions, Jose Rayo, Capablanca, and Alexander Aliekin, also play the C3 Sicilian. But in more modern times, the real champion of the opening certainly has to be Grandmaster Evgeny Sveshnikov. Sveshnikov, over the course of a 40-year career, played over 600 games against top-notch international competition and had a score of at least 70%. This is absolutely a fantastic result against Black's most popular opening. Then we will follow with a very important section on winning with the queenside majority. This is an extremely useful and important strategic concept that will allow you to not only increase your chess understanding, but to win many, many games where your opponent doesn't even realize what is happening to him. It's so gradual, it's so insidious. Now the C3 Sicilian, for myself, like I said, I first played it in my youth, brought me a decisive victory in the last round of the Association of College Unions International Championship. I also remember as a young master playing in the World Open, I was able to make a draw with the legendary Grandmaster Pal Benko. And I must say, I can hardly recall ever even losing a game with the C3 Sicilian. It's very fundamentally sound positionally, and in many variations you have your queenside majority built in, which gives you that extra edge. In the Sicilian defense after E4, C5, the move 2 C3 is relatively a newcomer compared to moves like 2 F4 or 2 B4, the wing gambit, which were analyzed by Greco as early as 1620. The move 2 C3 first appeared in tournaments in London. Hi, I'm Grandmaster Ron W. Henley, and today we're going to take a look at a series of DVDs on one of my favorite openings from even my childhood, the 2 C3 Sicilian. And why is this important? Well, to start with, quite a few players, including Gary Kasparov and Bobby Fischer, consider 1 E4 to be absolutely White's best move. And it's also pretty universally accepted that against E4, Black's most fighting response is C5, the Sicilian defense. And frankly, Who has time to learn every single specialized variation of the Sicilian defense? So, what you need is you need an opening like I had with the C3 Sicilian that you can basically play 2 C3 and black is playing on your home turf. So in this first series of DVDs, we will look at playing 2 C3 and then we will look at primarily 2 D5, which is black's most popular response. We will look at alternatives that black has and we'll show you how to play against them. The other things we will do is, rather than just show you specific variations, we'll start with a historical overview. In the historical overview, we will see fantastic strategists such as Aaron Nimzovich. We will see the 3rd and 4th world champions, Jose Rayo Capablanca and Alexander Aliekin, also play the C3 Sicilian. But in more modern times, the real champion of the opening certainly has to be Grandmaster Evgeny Sveshnikov. Sveshnikov, over the course of a 40-year career, played over 600 games against top-notch international competition and had a score of at least 70%. This is absolutely a fantastic result against black's most popular opening. Then we will follow with a very important section on winning with the queenside majority. This is an extremely useful and important strategic concept that will allow you to not only increase your chess understanding, but to win many, many games where your opponent doesn't even realize what is happening to him. It's so gradual, it's so insidious. Now the C3 Sicilian, for myself, like I said, I first played it in my youth, brought me a decisive victory in the last round of the Association of College Unions International Championship. I also remember as a young master playing in the World Open, I was able to make a draw with the legendary Grandmaster Pal Benko. And I must say, I can hardly recall ever even losing a game with the C3 Sicilian. It's very fundamentally sound positionally, and in many variations you have your queenside majority built in, which gives you that extra edge. In the Sicilian defense, which were analyzed by Greco as early as now, today's master, of course, knows that D4 is probably the best way for black to obtain equality. However, in that day, after E5, knight to C6, D4, we did in fact arrive at a position from the advanced French. Staunton correctly attacks the base of the white pawn chain on D4 with his queen, and white plays the gambit variation with bishop to D3. Black plays bishop to D7. And again, with the benefit of hindsight, thanks to the work of Aaron Nimzovich in the 1920s, we know that the proper way is to play c takes D4, c takes D4, and bishop D7, which is more precise. Note here, of course, that knight takes D4, knight takes D4, queen D4, bishop B5 check is a discovered attack on the black queen. Now going back to bishop D7, white now sees that his pawn on D4 is attacked multiple times. The correct course, of course, would be d takes C5, bishop C5, and castles with the plan of advancing with B4. This was demonstrated quite nicely in my system by Aaron Nimzovich, the classic game being Nimzovich white against George Sawi. Back to our game at hand in 1841, after bishop D7, white played bishop to C2. Black now played rook C8. And again, today's masters in this type of position know that you should play CD4, CD4, and knight B4, chase after this very powerful, dangerous white bishop. And if white tries to save the bishop with bishop to B3, then of course bishop to B5, working on the D3 square, is very strong. But again, keep in mind, this was London, 1841, quite a long time ago. A lot of this theory had not been developed. So after rook C8, as played in the game, white now castled, and black played A5. White played A4, securing the B5 square, and black now played a positional weakness, G6. Today, of course, we know we do not want to be weakening the dark squares around our king side. White now got the correct idea with d takes C5, and after bishop takes C5, knight A3, routing the knight to the B5 square. Black, for his part, undermined the white center with F6, and after EF6, knight F6, knight to B5. Castles, we had a fairly normal looking position. White now inserted his bishop on H6, and black, according to Staunton himself, played a very premature counterattack with knight G4. This does attack the bishop and attacks twice and attacks 3 times on the f2 pawn. Note, instead of knight g4, had black continued with rook f7, knight g5 is a little better for white, or the attacked bishop takes f2 check, rook takes f2, knight g4, looks very strong. It attacks the bishop, attacks the rook twice, but after queen d2, white simply connects everything and emerges with extra material. So going back to the game, after bishop h6, knight g4, white now accepted the exchange on f8, and after bishop f2 check, ducked his king in the corner, and on rook takes f8, played the very strong queen e2. This has a simple threat of h3, kicking the knight, followed by capturing on f2. After bishop c5, white followed with the powerful stroke, knight to d4. This attacks the knight on g4, the weak pawn on e6, and, probably most importantly, opens up the f-file. After rook f1, black still has problems to face. After e5, it appeared that he seemed to be doing okay. His knight is protected, his center pawns now seem mobile. However, queen to f3 reminded black how important the open f-file is, and the weakness on d5 and f7 is felt very rapidly. After knight d8, covering f7, queen takes d5 check, bishop e6, knight takes e6, knight takes e6, and the winning pin with bishop to b3. Staunton, in fact, at this point resigned. After knight f2 check, you simply chop it off, rook takes, bishop takes, and even stronger than capturing on e6 is a powerful knight to d6, cutting off the black queen's communication, leaving the knight pinned, leaving the black king very exposed. So all in all, a fantastic success for the first time out with the 2 c3 Sicilian. The next example we see of the 2 c3 Sicilian actually, surprisingly enough, occurred 1 year later in Paris, 1842. John William Schulten, a master, is playing white against the very famous Pierre Charles Saint-Amant. Saint-Amant, of course, was one of the strongest players of the time, and after c3, he now played e5. This, in my view, is a slightly dubious, from a positional point of view, continuation. However, it was quite popular for a while, and touted by the Russian trainer Filippenko much later in the next century. Now with Saint-Amant, of course, he sees white wants to play d4, and he puts a second pawn to pressure the d4 and f4 squares. White, in keeping with the spirit of the time, played f4. Of course, today's modern master would follow Sveshnikov's recommendation of knight f3, simply attacking the pawn on e5, and when black does something about the pawn with knight c6, bishop to c4. This very solid positional continuation offers white very reasonable chances for an advantage. The bishop is beautifully posted on the c4 to f7 diagonal. We will see some examples of that later when we look at the theoretical games. Back to our game from Paris, 1842, white continued very much in the style of the day, a la King's Gambit, with f4. After d6, played knight f3, and after e takes f4, established his pawn duo in the center with d4. After knight f6, bishop d3, bishop e7, bishop to f4. At this point, we can clearly say the opening has been a success for white. He has the pawn duo and excellent development. But after castles, knight d2, knight c6, castles, bishop g4, faced with the slightest bit of pressure on his center, white now mishandles the position. He played e5. This is a terrible mistake and premature, and tactically flawed because the bishop on d3 is simply on pre. Today's modern master would play d5, gaining a serious space advantage, and after knight h5, for example, attacking the bishop on f4, simply retreat with bishop e3, and after knight e5, again another retreat with bishop d2 would leave white very well placed. The black pieces are going to have to do something to resolve the situation, and white's going to enjoy a space advantage. So again, after bishop to f4, we can say the opening was clearly a success for white, but coming back to this position after e5, d takes e5, d takes e5, a terrible mistake according to Saint-Amant, and we have to agree with him. He recommended bishop e5, but even then, after knight takes, pawn takes, queen takes, pawn takes, and bishop takes on f6, black simply has one extra pawn and beautiful pair of bishops. Again, winning by today's standards. But going back to the game, after d takes e5, d takes e5, black now played knight h5. White has both of his bishops under attack, and after bishop h7 check, king takes, knight to g5 check, black continued accepting everything white offered, with bishop takes, queen takes, and knight takes f4. Clearly black has a winning material advantage. After knight e4, knight back to e6, queen h5 check, king g1, and again, very much in the spirit of the day, white threw everything that he could at black, but after queen e7, rook d7, queen takes, knight check, pawn takes, rook takes, and bishop takes, white now realized he was completely out of material, 2 rooks and 2 knights behind, and appropriately enough tossed in the towel. So, not a great outing for our second historical c3 Sicilian, although this defeat cannot be blamed on the opening. Clearly, the opening position reached after 7 bishop to f4 is excellent for white. In our next historical example, occurred quite a number of years later in Berlin, 1864. Playing black was the famous Adolf Anderssen, and playing white was the master Berthold Schul. After e4, c5, we now see the first example of the 2 knight f3 move order. And after e6, white now played c3, preparing to play d4 and establish the duo pawn center. After knight c6, d4, white did in fact establish the pawn duo on e4 and d4, and after d5, black has sort of a French defense setup. Sveshnikov considers that e5, playing the white side of the advanced French, is probably the best way for white to play for theoretical advantage. Sveshnikov was tremendously successful from this type of position and showed many fine examples of how to handle white's prospects. Back in Berlin, 1864, though, white played e takes d5, and after e takes d5, played bishop to e2. Bishop to b5 was Karpov's choice against Polgar in Linares 1994, a game that we will look at. That game was played, of course, 230 years later than our present game. Also, instead of bishop to e2, bishop to e3, pressuring the c5 pawn and trying to encourage clarification of the center, was a big favorite of Edward Rosenthalis, Soviet master who had a lot of success on the white side of the c3 Sicilian. I'm sure we will see many of his games much later. Back to Berlin 1864 after bishop e2, knight f6, castles, c takes d4. Now, again, today's modern master probably would take with the knight and try to play against the weak pawn or isolated pawn on d5, if you will. But after c takes d4, keeping this symmetrical pawn structure, bishop e7, knight c3, castles, bishop e3, white does have a slight lead in development, but it's pretty negligible in terms of creating an advantage. After bishop d6, queen d2, bishop e6, knight g5, bishop f5, and now white goes on a bit of a fishing expedition with f4. He voluntarily weakens his square on e4. After rook e8, h3, rook c8, knight back to f3, we can see clearly from a positional point of view, after knight e4, bishop e4, black stands better. Has complete control of the e4 square. His rooks are placed on the open files. That notwithstanding, white managed to draw the game in 56 moves. a pretty unconvincing performance on the third game out for our c3 Sicilian, but historically significant because it did introduce the 2 knight f3 move order. To continue with our historical development of the c3 Sicilian after e4, c5, c3, we have to push the clock ahead 34 more years. The master Simon Alapin, and thus the c3 Sicilian became known in some circles as the Alapin Sicilian, played it in the tournament of Vienna 1898. First game we will look at is Simon Alapin as white against Emanuel Stepan Schiffers, a noted master of the period. Schiffers played e6, and after d4, d5, again we get the French defense type formation. After e takes d5, e takes d5, knight to f3, black played knight to f6. Probably not the most accurate. After bishop to b5 check, knight c6, castles, c takes d4, white tossed in rook e1 check. After bishop e7, knight takes d4, and we can see white has quite a bit more pressure than in the previous game we studied. After bishop d7, white now played queen e2, keeping pressure on the e-file on the bishop on e7. After knight takes d4, cd4, bishop b5 check, queen takes, queen d7, and knight c3. Note that if white tried to take advantage of the pin on the e-file, black could just cleverly castle, and queen takes e7 fails to rook at f to e8 due to the weakness of the white first rank. Going back to the game after queen d7, knight c3, queen takes b5, knight b5, king d7, and black has managed to equalize. The king in the center in the endgame with the queens off the board is actually an advantage. After a3, a6, knight back to c3, rook at a to c8, bishop g5. This creates the possibility of capturing on f6 and then capturing on d5. Rook c4, bishop takes f6, bishop f6, and knight d5. Rook takes d4, and now white settled for a very minuscule advantage with knight takes f6, g takes f6, and rook at a to d1. What's instructive about this game is that after rook d1, this is one of the first games where we see white play the c3 Sicilian and then nurture a very tiny advantage all the way into the endgame. Later, when we learn to play the c3 Sicilian, this is already a mistake by black. It turns out he needs to play his king to e6 so that he has the c-file available to offer counterplay for his own rook. After king c6, white now played rook to d3. The white rook is able to lift over to the king side and attack the black pawns. After rook e8 threatening mate on e1, simply king f1, rook e5, and now we see the superior mobility of the white rook. First attacks the f6 pawn, threatens it with check. After f5, then rook h3. Black now plays a5, looking to get his own queenside counterplay in gear with rook to b5, but white comes first with rook takes h7. After rook b5, rook takes f7, and rook b2, black's hoping to get his queenside pawn majority going. White plays a very nice in-between check here, and after king b5 is able to capture the pawn on b5 with check, and now has 3 connected passed pawns on the king side. After king a4, it clearly becomes a race. We've now reached the situation where time is the most critical element. After g4, rook c2, g5, we can see white is not only ahead in material, but well ahead in time. After b5, g6, rook c8, now the h-pawn kicks it into gear to join the g-pawn. After b4, ab, ab, and rook f7, white has a decisive advantage, 7. Black tried one last trick with advantage all the way in to winning the game. The second game from Vienna 1898, where Simon Alapin played the c3 Sicilian was against the redoubtable German Dr. Siegbert Tarrasch. Now, an interesting point is that Alapin was not particularly a great theoretician or anything, but he played c3 just simply to avoid all the other variations of the Sicilian defense at that time. His best results were first and second in Chigorin and St. Petersburg. He did win match victories against von Bartheleben and against Levitsky, and drew a match with Karl Schlechter, and also finished fifth in Monte Carlo and first prize in Munich 1911. So Simon Alapin was a player of some note. However, his results with the c3 Sicilian were not absolutely overwhelming. For example, if we look at this game here with Tarrasch, we will see after Queen a5, very interesting, bit unusual, and probably borderline dubious idea by Black. Black realizes that White wants to play the d4 pawn duo, and thus he pins the c3 pawn. After knight f3, knight c6, White now played knight a3. Sveshnikov himself, many years later, would actually play a3, and after e6, played d4, and after knight takes d4, thanks to the pin on the c3 pawn, knight d4, cd4, important to toss in the move b4 and break the pin. After the queen backed up, c takes d4, White was able to establish the pawn duo. After knight f6, bishop d3, d5, e5, knight d7, White had a very, very good variation of the French defense, and after rook a2, Sveshnikov scored a nice victory. We will look at that complete game later in the theoretical game section. Back to our game from Vienna, 1898, after knight a3, the knight does threaten to bop over to c4 and attack the prematurely developed black queen. After e6, White played knight to c4 right away. This may not be the strongest continuation. Probably today, I would prefer a slower build-up with bishop e2, followed by castles, and simply d4. I've now established my pawn duo, and have to ask the black queen what she's doing out on a5. But after knight c4, queen c7, White now played d4, but after cd4, took with the knight. Probably more thematic would be to take with the pawn on d4, and after d5, ed5, ed5, knight at c to e5, White does have a slight edge due to his beautiful outpost on e5. Back to our game at hand, after knight takes d4, Tarrasch now goes for kind of a Paulson Sicilian setup. Surprisingly modernistic style of playing he shows here. Again, keep in mind this is Vienna 1898. After bishop d3, he plays b5, attacking the knight, and after knight e3, knight f6, castles, bishop b7, knight f3, and bishop d6. And thanks to his bishops raking the white king side, Black is already slightly better. Rook e1, knight to e5, exchanging off a queenside knight for a kingside knight. A very good idea, and increasing his control over the dark squares. After knight takes, bishop takes, we can already see the black bishops have really opened up nice diagonals against the white king. After knight f1, we have to say the opening has absolutely been a failure for White at this point. He has no active plan and a passive knight on the king side. Castles, queen e2, bishop to c6, bishop g5, rook at f to e8. White now played queen e3, and Black proceeds a dark square campaign, offers to let White surrender the two bishops. After bishop h4, knight to h5. He now takes control of the f4 square. After bishop g3, sinks on into f4, and we can see Black has played a beautiful plan of control on the dark squares. After bishop back to c2, he now anchors in with g5. White now cartwheels his knight back into the game with knight d2, and after queen d8, knight f3, f6, goes ahead and further secures the dark squares. After knight e5, fe5, White does, from an optical point of view, have the bishop pair. However, the knight on f4 certainly does more than hold its own against the white bishops. After f3, king h8, he now starts to build up on the king side. on queen c5 attacking the e5 pawn, black simply defends it, and on queen d6, not clear where that queen's going, rook g8, black begins to build for the kingside pawn break. a4, white decides to open a file on the queen side, try to change a pair of rooks, but here Tarrasch shows one of his very, very important principles. When you have a space advantage, you want to keep pieces on the board, or when you're trying to build for an attack. And therefore he plays rook at a to f8. In my mind, this is an exclamation point move. This shows very clear thinking that he wants to attack on the king side, and therefore when you're attacking you want to have as many pieces as possible to outmaneuver the opponent. White plays bishop d3, trying to put pressure on the b5 pawn. Note that AB, c4, and after bc4, rook a5, trying to disrupt black's plan, might have been a better way to go. But even here, after rook to b8, black gets counterplay against the b2 pawn. After the less aggressive bishop d3, black now gets the program underway on the king side with h5. After a takes b, white starts to passively defend on the king side with rook f1, h4, and now black decides, white decides he needs to remove the knight on f4. However, note that passive retreat with bishop f2, g4, just simply looks like all systems go for the black team. So back to the game. After h4, bishop takes f4, black now plays g takes f4, opening the g file. The g2 point in particular is very sensitive. White decides to flee with his king. Black simply protects his e5 pawn and prepares to triple on the half-open file. After rook h1, black very alertly sacrifices his h-pawn to simply guarantee that the file is open. After g takes h3, rook at f to g8, white could find nothing better than continuing to flee. Let's see, if he contests the file with rook to g1, well, black does exchange one pair of rooks, but then throws in queen h4 check. After king f1, queen h3 check, king f2, queen h2 check, black wins the rook and the game. So, going back to black doubling rooks, white decides to flee. Black now penetrates to the 7th rank, and after bishop e2, plays the tactic bishop takes e4. This piece sacrifice exposes the white king and secures black a passed pawn after f takes e4. If queen takes d7 instead, one way would be rook d8, and then on queen b5, queen h4 check, king f1, and queen f2 mate. So going back to the piece sacrifice, bishop takes e4, f takes e4. And what's interesting to note about the sacrifice with bishop takes e4 is that this wasn't, throw everything at him in the romantic style. This was actually the culmination of superior strategical play. So after white accepted with f takes e4, f3, another Tarrasch principle, the pass to expand. And we see that in full bloom here, as the bishop on e2 is simply overpowered. After bishop f1, Tarrasch now hit him with rook g1. This attacks the rook in the corner, and of course white resigned. After rook g1, the powerful f2 check, and we see again the pawn will promote on g1. A superb example by black, and again, the opening did become known as Alpen Sicilian for a while. He did play it in 2 games, however his results were rather mixed. In addition to the Russian master Alpen, who we just saw 2 games from, after e4, c5, notable mention should be made of Aaron Nimzowitsch and Savily Tartakower, both who made considerable contributions to the development of the c3 Sicilian. Nimzowitsch used it in fabulous games against Chahis, Carlsbad 1911, which we will look at next, and later against Vidmar in the New York 1927 tournament. Tartakower played it against Rete and Kali in 2 games. The game Nimzowitsch-Chahis from Carlsbad 1911 continued. knight c6, d4, already white has established the pawn duo in the center, cd, cd, and now d5. Now here, Nimzowitsch captured on d5. Trying to play for an advanced French in this situation would not do well for white, because after bishop to f5, black follows with e6, and he solved his major problem in the French defense, namely the development of the light-squared bishop. So after d5, white captures on d5. This pulls the queen out, but the white isolated pawn on d4 is under attack. However, after knight f3, e5 further opens the board. After knight c, attacking the black queen, bishop to b4, pinning the knight. After bishop d2 breaks in, black now has a choice. Either move the queen or give up the bishop on c3 for the knight, which is what he does. And now bishop takes reinforces the pawn on d4 and threatens to capture on e5. Black now plays e4. Note, of course, that after e takes d4, knight d4, knight d4, queen d4, queen d4, bishop d4, white has a powerful, beautiful bishop for the endgame on d4. Attacks both g7 and a7. White has a clear, perceptible advantage in this type of position. Therefore, black plays e4 and tries to keep the bishop on c3 locked in behind its pawn on d4. White, of course, continues forward with knight e4, threatens to play bishop to c4. Knight takes e5, d takes e5, knight e7, we reach one of the critical theoretical positions for the c3 Sicilian. White has the two bishops. The pawns e5 and e4 for both sides can potentially be a bit weak. White in this position has queen e2, bishop e2, and the move played in the game, queen a4 check, as methods to try and exploit or create an advantage. Nimzowitsch played queen a4 check. After bishop d7, he then dropped his queen back to a3, taking control of the a3 f8 diagonal. Black now played in very enterprising fashion. He played e3. A later game with Kramnik and Piquet from Monaco Rapid Tournament 1995 saw bishop to g4. But after h3, bishop h5, g4, e3, rook h2, white had a very definite advantage and went on to win the game. In our present game, after e3, black is hoping for f takes e3 and then queen e4 with some pretty juicy counterplay. The e3 pawn is hanging with check, the knight might pop up to d5, queen h4 check might be on the agenda, the g2 pawn is under attack, so it makes it difficult to develop the bishop. So we can see that e3 was a very alluring move. Nimzowitsch, however, plays f3 and maintains the integrity of his pawn structure. After queen e6, rook d1, black now plays knight f5. White played bishop d3, and after queen g6, the white pawn on g2 is under attack. White castled, and now black played an interesting idea. e2. This pawn sacrifice is a combination pawn fork and clearance and deflection. It deflects white bishop from d3, which is pinning the knight. It also clears the e3 square for the black knight, which we see after bishop takes e2, knight to e3. This looks very promising for black. He threatens queen takes g2 mate, and he knight forks both of the white rooks. Black does in fact appear to be doing quite okay here. However, Nimzowitsch had seen a bit further, and now plays king up to f2. We have to remember the king is a very valuable attacking and defensive unit. After knight takes d1, of course note, queen takes pawn check, simply king takes knight, leads black nowhere except a piece down. After king f2 attacking the knight, knight takes d1, rook takes d1, white is basically sacrificed in exchange, but has a nice bishop and pawn for it, has beautiful control of the a3 to f8 diagonal, which is very annoying for black as it keeps him from castling. He also has his rook on the open file, and of course the pair of bishops. Today's modern master would consider that white has absolutely full compensation in this position, if not advantage in practical play. After queen b6 check, bishop to d4, again we can see black is actually the one who controls the dark squares. Queen back to e6, b3 prepares to bring the second bishop up to c4, and after bishop c6, bishop c5 ensures black won't be castling anytime soon. Queen to f5. Note that taking the pawn on e5 simply opens the e-file, and this certainly cannot benefit black with his king still on e8. For example, after bishop c4, queen c3, bishop back to b4, queen c2 check, rook d2, queen back to g6, and now the powerful move queen a5. This threatens penetration with either queen e5 check or queen c7. And again, we can see the poor black king is simply hemmed in on e8. So going back to the game after bishop c5, queen to f5, Nimzowitsch now found the very clever queen back to c1. In theory, bishop to d6 may have been an absolutely stronger move, but queen c1 certainly was not bad. After rook d8, he sunk the bishop in on d6, again keeping the black king cut off, and avoiding the exchange of rooks. After h5, bishop to d3 harassed the black queen, queen e6, and now queen g5. Very powerful move. He threatens bishop to f5. He also threatens the pawn on g6. If the pawn on g6 tries to go forward, then bishop to c4 picks up juice because the e7 square has to be guarded, and then probably a move like queen d7 has to be played, and then white simply inches in. Moves like queen f6 and on rook g8, probably a backing up discovered attack with a move like bishop back, attacking the queen, and when the queen goes over, a move like bishop takes pawn check, queen takes, and rook takes mate. So going back after queen g5, this powerful penetrating move, black played rook d7, protecting the very sensitive e7 square. Unfortunately, that did allow bishop to f5, zapping the queen against the rook. After rook takes d6, Nimzowitsch simply played e takes on d6. The threats are multiple. The queen is on pre, the d pawn is ready to advance, the g7 pawn is hanging. It's all over. After f6, he finished the game off with queen g6 check, queen to f7 trying to save his queen, but d7 check. Again, we see the power of the passed pawn. After bishop takes d7, note of course king e7, rook e1 check is just simply the end. And after d7 check, bishop takes, queen takes, black in fact resigned. Of course, king takes and rook takes d7 leaves white absolutely a full piece up. No point for black to play on. A very powerful performance by Aaron Nimzowitsch. In this game, we see a very important theoretical position which occurs after e4, knight e5, knight takes e5, d takes e5, and knight e7. Again, white has queen a4 check, as played by Nimzowitsch. Queen e2 is also possible, and bishop e2. White's tried all three of these in order to prove an advantage from this position. As we saw from the last game, Aaron Nimzowitsch had a great understanding of the opening for white, and was excellent at creating problems for his opponents. Nonetheless, his and Hartikauer's views on the c3 Sicilian weren't taken all that seriously, and it was considered to be a bit of a drawish weapon. Even so, the third and fourth world champions, Capablanca and Alyakin, also contributed to the development of the opening. The next game we will look at, Jose Raul Capablanca against Moshe Cherniak from Buenos Aires, the Olympiad in 1939. This actually was arrived at by transposition from a Caro-Kann, but after d4, d5, ed, cd, c4, knight c6, we now get a familiar position. After knight f3, bishop to g4, we've reached a typical c3 Sicilian. After cd5, queen d5, bishop e2, e6. Now, of course, note Black cannot win a pawn with bishop takes f3, bishop takes f3, attacking the queen on d5, and queen takes d4, of course, is a horrific blunder because bishop takes c6 is with check, followed by queen d4. But going back after bishop to e2, Black has a number of continuations. e5 has been played, knight f6 has been played, but the most solid is considered to be e6. White now castles, and after knight f6, knight to c3, the black queen has to move. Queen a5, h3, putting the question to the bishop, and after bishop h5, a3, trying to take away the b4 square from the black pieces. Black plays rook d8, looking to immediately put pressure on the isolated white pawn on d4. Capablanca gains space on the king side with g4, and after bishop g6, now goes for space on the queen side with b4. A very ambitious play. Black would probably be well served to simply back it up, chill out with queen c7. Instead, after b4, Black went in for bishop takes b4. After a takes b4, queen a1, queen to b3, this type of sacrifice is quite common for white. You sack the exchange in the corner, but the black queen can become something of a liability and prone to being trapped. However, Black thought he'd calculated this and came up with a very nice tactic, rook takes d4. In fact, we can see, if knight takes d4, knight takes d4, attacks the queen, attacks the bishop, and after queen c4, Black has the tactic queen takes c3. After queen c3, knight e2 check forks the king and queen and leaves Black with 2 extra pieces. So it was clear that when Black entered this, he was calculating and counting on rook takes d4 as his saving grace. Note also that bishop to b2 fails to simply rook takes b4. After queen takes b4, Black has the counter desperado, queen takes f1 check, king f1, and knight takes b4, again emerging with an extra exchange and a few pawns. So after rook takes d4, Black appeared to be doing quite okay. However, Capablanca now played the very fine retort bishop a3. Of course, this traps the black queen. White now had to rely on the deflection motif, bishop c2. But after queen takes c2, queen takes a3, the black queen has escaped, but also walked onto a fork square. In the game, Black continued with queen takes b4. His best chance to salvage the situation would be rook takes g4 check, h takes g4, queen b4, and he has quite a few pawns for only 1 piece. Back to the game after queen b4, knight at f takes d4, knight d4, knight d4. Black now had to castle. Taking the knight on d4 loses very abruptly to queen c8 check, queen d8, bishop b5 check, king e7, and queen takes b7. When Black still has problems, for example, if he plays knight d7, simply rook d1, piling on the pinned piece numerous times, and instead of knight d7, if he tries to duck with his king, then rook to the c-file, and the powerful threat of rook c8 is very hard to meet. So going back to the game, after Capablanca took on d4, Black castled. But, to his credit, he does have 3 pawns for 1 bishop. So now it becomes a struggle of the extra bishop versus the 3 black pawns. Rook to d1, knight to d5, bishop to f3. We can see the bishop immediately gets to work on this long diagonal. Knight to f4, the knight finds a nice home and attacks the pawn on h3, king h2, and e5. This secures one knight and attacks the white knight. However, it also weakens the king side and brings the white pieces closer to the king side. And this bishop is now firing in on this pawn. This rook is now on an open file. After g6, the white knight comes back. However, notice even Capablanca could have played a little more precise with rook to b1, queen a3, rook b3, and then on queen a4, the maneuver knight e7 check, king g7, and queen c3 would have been very powerful. The pawn on e5 is under attack, the pawn on b7 is under attack. This would have been a winning advantage for white very quickly. But back to our historical game after knight e3, knight back to e6. Black obviously is hoping to plant his knight in on the fat square on d4, but first things first, knight to d5 attacks the black queen. And also notice that it covers the vital f4 square. After queen a3, attacking the bishop on d3, rook d3, counterattacking the queen, and on queen a1, rook to d1, Capablanca gains time here by repeating moves. He now improves the position with queen d2, threatening the deadly queen h6. King g7 to guard the h6 square, but now queen e2. This keeps an eye on the pawn on e5 and keeps the knight from coming into d4. After f6, he's now managed to loosen the king position up a bit. He now plays queen e3. This threatens rook a3, followed by scoring the pawn on a7. After a6, rook back to d1, queen to b2. He now plays the retreat knight to c3, a very powerful move. This threatens rook to d7 check, trying to collect the pawn on b7. When white played knight to d4, rook to b1 came at the pawn from another angle. And in fact, after queen c2, bishop to e4, an open field queen trap. A nice game by the third world champion, and one of the few examples of him playing the c3 Sicilian with white. The last game from our historical overview is a brilliancy by Alexander Alekhine. After e4, c5, c3, d5, e takes d5, queen takes d5, d4, knight c6, knight f3, bishop g4, bishop e2, cd, cd. Like Capablanca, we see Alekhine play with the isolated queen pawn with white. After e6, knight c3, bishop to b4, pinning the knight, white castles. Black has a choice. He can capture the knight on c3 or move his queen. In this game, black elected to move the queen, thinking he's attacking on c3. Here, Alekhine played what he became quite known for, a pawn sacrifice, a3, inviting white to capture twice on c3. In fact, after bishop c3, bc3, we can see that queen c3 is very dangerous. Bishop d2 attacking the queen. After queen b2, rook b1, queen a3. White could simply capture on b7 with very good compensation, or after queen a3, could play knight e5. Typical variation in Alekhine style would be bishop e2, queen e2, and if black takes the second pawn, with knight takes d4, queen c4. Gives white all of the open lines and a tremendous attack. The knight on d4 is under attack, bishop to b4 possibly is threatened, rook takes b7 is threatened. This is very typical of Alekhine's dynamic style. In fact, after bishop c3, bc3, Garry Kasparov's boyhood hero was Alexander Alekhine. He loved his beautiful combinations and analyzed quite a few of his games, and in this position Garry suggested that black should simply play knight at gd7 with a small advantage for white. Two bishops, hanging pawns versus black's position. But in the game after a3, black played knight to f6. And now Alekhine showed his very fine ability to do deep calculation. He played the brilliant pawn sacrifice d5. This totally opens up the board to expose the black position, since he's not castled yet. Alekhine points out that if the immediate A takes B4 exchange sacrifice, similar to what we saw in the Capablanca game, queen takes A1, queen to B3, again, similar motif, bishop takes F3, bishop to E3, immediately attacking and trapping the queen, queen takes F1, bishop F1, and now bishop D5, black can head for a barricade. Alekhine pointed out that after knight D5, B5, and knight at c to E7, followed by castles, black has good chances of successfully defending himself, and in this situation does actually have two rooks for the queen, plus very powerful barricade square on D5. Therefore, in this position after knight F6, Alekhine found the fantastic resource D5. The point here is black has two ways to capture on D5. After knight D5, E takes D5. Part of the motif with D5 is that it was a clearance sacrifice to make the D4 square available. After knight D4, bishop E6, white has the rotating maneuver knight to B3. This attacks the black queen, defends the rook on A1, and simply prepares A takes B4, snagging the bishop. That was a large part of the whole calculation with D5. So this D5 pawn sacrifice, black decided to take with a pawn. But now, Alekhine captures the bishop on B4, and after queen takes, has sacrificed the rook in the corner, very, very similar to what we saw in the Capablanca game. But now he follows up with knight to D2. This exposes the bishops on each other and prepares knight to B3, trapping the queen. After bishop takes E2, queen takes E2 check, knight to E7. Note that king F8, knight to B3, queen A6, only square, B5, queen B6, pinning the pawn to the loose knight on B3, knight A4, knight D4, white has the very subtle queen back to D1, and after queen takes B5, knight D4, white has a winning position. So going back to queen E2 check, black decided to interpose his knight on E7 and sets the trap. After rook E1, he simply castles. Note that queen takes E7 runs afoul of rook E8. Again, motif we saw earlier, pinning the queen to the rook and taking advantage of white's back rank. However, Alekhine had seen this a bit further, and after castles, he now continued with his knight rotation maneuver, knight to B3. Again, pseudo-trapping the queen on A1. The queen has only one square, and the difference is he is able to exchange queens first, and then capture the knight on E7. So if we take a look at the material count, white has 5 pawns, and black has a rook and 2 pawns for a bishop and a knight. So materially speaking, black's doing okay, however, the white pieces are very active, and the black pawns are very, very weak. Black plays rook to B8, trying to get counterplay against the pawn on B4. Alekhine alertly plays B5, closing the B file to mimic the activity of the black rooks. And after A takes B5, he now plays rook takes A7. So now we see black only has a rook and 1 pawn for the 2 white minor pieces. After B4, knight E2, we see that the D4 square beckons to the white pieces. After rook at F to C8, F3 takes away the E4 square, prepares to advance the king, rook A8, rook takes, and king F2. One of the things that made Alekhine a powerful player in his time was fantastic technique. Knight D7, knight F4, pawn on D5. After knight B6, notice he doesn't rush with bishop to E3, but instead brings his king into the game. After rook C8, preparing to penetrate to C2, he simply slides over with king D3. Black now recklessly weakens himself with G5, and after knight H5, realized he has good chances of simply losing another pawn and resigned. Again, a nice little brilliancy by Alekhine. The isolated queen pawn and the very thematic, beautifully calculated D5 pawn sacrifice is what made this game particularly notable. This game was a big favorite of Garry Kasparov's. He loved the dynamic play that black Alekhine, the 4th world champion, showed in this game. We will now look at some of the plans and strategies, a bit of an overview if you will, for both sides. After e4, c5, c3, of course, d5 is the most popular, and knight to f6 is probably second most popular. We will look at plans associated with d5. There's also the move order to g6, and after d4, cd4, cd4, d5, white pretty much has to play e5 if he hopes to try and achieve an advantage. Note that instead of e5, e takes d5, knight f6 transposes to a branch of the Panov-Botvinnik-Caro-Kann that's not considered particularly dangerous for black. Basically, black will recover the pawn on d5 and have comfortable development for his pieces. However, there is one interesting idea. After g6, d4, cd, cd, d5, knight c3 is a very interesting